Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this exclusive interview. Now, Ukraine's recent offensive in the Kursk region has unsettled Moscow's war narrative, and American and British intelligence chiefs suggest that it's raising doubts among Russia's elite. CIA Director William Burns and MI6 Chief Richard Moore both highlighted the operation as a tactical success that's exposing Russia's vulnerabilities. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss this is Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow of Russia and Eurasia Programme. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good morning.
Can you help us understand what specific vulnerabilities that these intelligence chiefs are talking about that's exposed by Ukraine in the latest operation?
It's largely what you discussed in your introduction. This has been a startling move by Ukraine, particularly because it's exposed just how difficult it is for Russia to respond to Ukraine taking the initiative like this. Nobody expected it to be so easy for Ukraine to effectively walk in through a practically undefended section of the Russian front, and it's exposed a number of the reasons why Ukraine can in fact seize that initiative. For instance, the fact that Russia apparently does not have the reserves ready and in place to try to counter this kind of incursion, to try to counter this kind of Ukrainian attack, which undercuts, of course, the suggestion that Russia has bottomless pools of manpower. Also, it doesn't seem to be completely correct that Russia has continued as though nothing were happening in its pushes forward in the Donbass. They've gone largely passive on large areas of that front, and it's really only around that Pokrovsk area that you mentioned that the attacks are continuing. So yes, there's no doubt it will have caused just as much surprise in Moscow as it did to the rest of the world.
So some of these intelligence chiefs have been coming out and saying that this is actually causing unease among Russian elites. What do you think the word on the street is going to be inside Russia?
Well, we can never guess precisely what's going on in those internal conversations within the Kremlin. And of course, all we can see from what the Kremlin is doing in terms of managing Russia's domestic information space is the same as Russian citizens see. And there, the reaction has been interesting. After this normal period of paralysis that you so often have when the Russian information warfare and propaganda apparatus is taken by surprise by something that's happened, the response has been almost to normalize this, to say, well, this is part and parcel of being at war. It's like the weather, you can't really control it, as opposed to treating this like a major disaster or a major setback. But there's no doubt that it will have shown to people sitting in the Kremlin that actually know the war is not going the way that the military chiefs in Russia have been saying it is, and the way Russia has been telling its own population it has. Russia didn't have the situation under control, and that's bound to be unnerving.
Right. So a lot to figure out here. Like you mentioned, there is an attempt at managing domestic messaging and trying to paint this as business per usual. But there is a very stark contradiction with the kind of image that they do want to send out to their population. Do you think people will be the wiser to kind of notice this contradiction, or is the information control within the country so tight that they will not be able to kind of realize what's actually going on?
Well, let's not forget that Russia has been working so hard on information control within the country for the last 2 decades that in some cases it doesn't really matter what people can or cannot discern in terms of what's happening in the outside world. If you can't talk about it, if you can't share that information because it's been criminalized to do anything that criticizes the war or casts doubt on the performance of Russia's own troops, then that information simply is not going to spread except through private means. But of course, you also have a large number of displaced people from that Kursk region who have been spread across Russia. They will be bringing with them their own stories of Russian state incompetence, of the fact that the military could not defend them. And that, by passing through word of mouth to a greater sector of the population, may well have a greater effect than anything that might be shared through traditional media.
Right, and like you mentioned earlier, even the push in the Donbass region is actually slowing down. We do see a little bit of movement in Pokrovsk region, but as we were speaking with a Ukrainian general not long ago, there's actually an assault on like 6-7 different fronts, and Pokrovsk is actually the only one that's even seeing a hint of movement, and even that is slowing down. Do you think that this slow advance is a sign of military fatigue or strategic thinking?
It's an indication that perhaps Ukraine did in fact succeed in one of those stated objectives for this incursion into Kursk, which was to draw Russia's main effort away from that Donbass front. So it's tempting to assume that, yes, that since that has largely subsided, with the exception of Pokrovsk, where Russia is pushing forward at immense cost of casualties, then Ukraine did in fact succeed in drawing that effort away. So yes, it's another way in which this is as you described it earlier, a tactical achievement. But the real impact is not so much where the front line on the map is, it's the strategic effects of what's going on.
Right, and speaking of strategic effects, I want to go back to the kind of political unease when it comes to the Russian elites. Do you think at least this would give the Putin regime at least sort of challenge some sort of internal pushback, or is it just so tightly controlled that you can't see any elites really pushing back against Vladimir Putin?
We can never tell, of course, precisely what's going on inside the Kremlin offices, but the indications are that Putin is taking decisions based on input from a very small number of people who agree with him about the state of the world and what to do about it. So if there is dissent among senior figures within Russia, that may not actually have an impact on decision-making in the end. Of course, that's a situation that is stable until it's not. I think one of the other things that the intelligence chiefs you're referring to discussed in their conversation was, don't confuse a tight grip on power with a stable grip on power in Russia. And when these things start to come unstuck, they unravel very rapidly.
All right, it's a very interesting phenomenon that you mentioned there, that how it's stable until it is not. We're seeing almost 3 different parallel universes trying to work in conjunction to somehow make this thing work. We have the perception of the general public with tightly controlled information. There's the elites that seems to be a little bit uneasy, and then we have the Kremlin, which lives and resides within its own bubble. How do you see this all crumbling down if anything goes wrong?
Well, first of all, it's not going to happen soon. One thing that is consistent with Russia is that the resilience in the amount of time it takes for things to go badly wrong before there's that tipping point and we have that final collapse is far longer than most people normally expect. But, of course, the key point is that nobody can tell when the Russian population have had enough of what is being inflicted on them by the leadership, and that includes the Kremlin. It is always unpredictable when that collapse finally comes. But for the time being, Russia appears to have a sufficiently robust economy to continue even at the massive amounts of spending that they're diverting into the military. And there don't seem to be any repeats of the kind of threat to Putin's power, the challenge to Putin's power that we saw in 2023 from Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner group. There's very little likelihood of anybody arriving in a similar position to he did, where he had both an argument with the Kremlin and a private army to back it up. So for the time being, that grip on power should be remaining stable.
All right. What about Ukrainians' momentum in the Kursk region? Do you think this momentum could be sustained, or do you think they've actually achieved most of the objective they set out to do?
It seems Ukraine has actually slowed down its own advance, not as a result of sustained Russian resistance, but simply because they appear to have moved far enough and now consolidating their gains. The fact that that has now dropped out of the news headlines has been interpreted by some people as bad news, as an indication that this has failed. I think instead it's the fact that it has become normalized. There's nothing further to report, and now Ukraine is firmly in control of this slice of Russian territory.
Right. Normalization, I think, is a word you also brought up earlier when it comes to the narration that Russia is trying to paint over. Do you think that this contradiction is again going to prop up if there's any more conscription attempts or to kind of consolidate its military forces, even though on one hand they're trying to say that this is business as usual?
That's right. That's one of the things that everybody has been watching out for, how exactly Russia is going to replenish its manpower reserves and whether they will hold off from a mass mobilization for very much longer. For the time being, the assessments that we read suggest that Russia is succeeding in its stealth mobilization, and it's dredging the manpower from prisons, from foreigners, from immigrant workers, etc., and is not getting close to the point where it needs to announce that mass mobilization that would affect the politically active people in the major cities. However, of course, that too is subject to a time limit. There's only so far that Russia can go continuing down its current track before it starts to run out of people again.
Right. How do you see this offensive impacting Ukraine's negotiation or diplomatic position with Russia?
It's been stated as one of the potential aims for having a slice of Russian territory under Ukrainian control, that this provides a bargaining chip, it provides some leverage that Ukraine can use if and when there are eventually peace talks. But of course, the precondition for peace talks is Russia actually being interested in peace. And Russia's shown no interest whatsoever in changing its overall objective from the destruction of Ukraine. It's impossible to negotiate with an aggressor that simply wants to exterminate you.
And last but not least, I also want to draw attention to this joint appearance by Burns and Moore, and whether it's also a statement about Western intelligence coordination, or am I just reading too much into the tea leaves?
Certainly, it's a statement that these two services work closely together, and that's, of course, a carefully crafted message, given all of the different threats that they laid out, all of the different issues facing Western security that they wanted to highlight. And of course, the message of standing together against them is an important one. But I think we should look closely at exactly what it was that they were pointing to as the major challenges to people's lives and livelihoods in the West. It is not just Russia. It's also China. It's also the campaigns of sabotage and terrorism that we're facing, and so much else besides. Those, I think, are the key messages that came out from that meeting and from the opinion piece that they jointly wrote for the Financial Times a couple of days ago here in London.
All right, can you help us elaborate a little bit about that, especially when it comes to the involvement of China?
They pointed to China as what they called the principal security and intelligence threat for the 21st century. And that's interesting language because, of course, Russia is the proximate threat. It's the one that has the most immediate plans and intentions and capabilities to cause serious damage to Western countries. But they're pointing to China as being the longer-term problem. And that seems to suggest that they think of the Russia challenge as something that will eventually pass. That's an interesting assessment, given that Putin has stated very clearly that his ambition does not stop at Ukraine, and other intelligence chiefs in the West are pointing to Russia rebuilding its armed forces with the intent of attacking NATO.
All right, so do you think that they know something that we don't, or is it more like an optimistic projection?
Well, they're intelligence chiefs. They always know something that we don't. But it's interesting balancing these different threats between them, because they are making the point that it is not just one problem that we're facing at a time. These are not sequential problems; they're concurrent ones, and therefore they are putting out this message for people to be alert and aware of all of the different challenges that are facing the way they live.
Right, so definitely a lot going into this, and when it comes to these challenges that needs to be dealt with. Meanwhile, thank you so much for all your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks again for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.